Adam doesn't have free will. I am not convinced for a moment that Milton's Adam considered sinning until somebody told him that he could do it. Hello everyone. I recently finished reading John Milton's Paradise Lost, and I want to talk about it. It can be a challenge sometimes when I am reading a book and try to guess how I may have read it differently if I had different information. How many books have I liked more because I was perfectly primed by an introduction, and how many less? Sometimes I get the feeling that I should just skip an introduction or even read it afterwards, and I put this one down halfway through. This has an introduction by Christopher Ricks. I haven't read anything else of his work, so I can't speak to his criticism, but I mostly want to talk about his work here as an introduction. Let me read to you actually how it opens. A controversial poet, Milton. Against Milton there is Ezra Pound, despising his asinine bigotry, his beastly Hebraism, the coarseness of his mentality. For Milton there is Dr. Johnson. His work is not the greatest of heroic poems, only because it is not the first. Pound actually shows up again later. Milton is the worst sort of poison. He is a thoroughgoing decadent in the worst sense of the term. If he had stopped writing after the short poems, one might respect him. Now, Ezra Pound is a weird guy, but the introduction notes other people who also have had negative opinions of John Milton. Also noted is a general academic apathy regarding Milton, given by way of a Douglas Bush quote. The literati have not for decades granted Milton a place in the canon of poets who minister to our needs. Now, true or not, this struck me as an odd way to introduce a work like this, because unless I'm sorely mistaken, or if things have changed since 1968 when this edition came out, I don't think the average reader of Paradise Lost in a mass market paperback is aware that his status as serious literature is even in question. This introduction, that argues that we should take Milton seriously, actually introduces the seed of doubt that comes with the knowledge of his opposition. So I stopped reading the introduction at that point, but did the snippet I get change my reading experience? I don't think so. Because although I wasn't aware of the modern and contemporary controversy, I was aware of the long-standing one. People have always had questions. Within 40 years of the publication of Paradise Lost, you have figures like Dryden and John Dennis who point out that Milton has, at least technically, put the devil in the position of the protagonist. Within 100 years after them, you have Robert Burns saying, "Give me a spirit like my favorite hero, Milton's Satan." And perhaps the most notorious reinterpretation is William Blake's, who says, "The reason Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when he wrote of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it." When I was starting to read, I started to have a little bit of dread that maybe I knew too much going in, that I wouldn't be able to read the poem for myself, that I wouldn't be able to trust that my response to it was genuine, rather than under the influence of some other figure's idiosyncratic interpretation. In retrospect, I think that if I had gone in blind, I might have put this down after book 3. Two things saved me from putting it down, and one of them was the assurances I had from Christopher Ricks and from William Blake that I didn't have to like Milton's God to like his poem. The other thing that kept me going was the exquisite beauty in the opening passages of Book 3, which by my estimation may be Milton at his best. They're where we see Milton as a human. They're where we meet him as poet, as narrator. In those passages he sings of his blindness and his hope that from within his darkness he may be able to capture and describe things unseen. This is also where Milton presents his doubts of his own ability to sing adequately of God. And for the apology he gives here, one might forgive his inevitable failure. Here's from the very beginning of Book 3. Hail, holy light, offspring of heaven firstborn, or of the eternal co-eternal beam, may I express thee, unblamed, since God is light, and never but in unapproached light, dwelt from eternity, dwelt then in thee, bright effluence of bright essence increate. He talks of his blindness. Thee I revisit safe, and feel thy sovereign vital lamp, but thou revisitest not these eyes that roll in vain, to find thy piercing ray, and find no dawn. But cloud instead, and ever-during dark surrounds me, from the cheerful ways of men cut off, and for the book of knowledge fair presented with a universal blank. So much the rather thou celestial light shine inward, and the mind through all her powers irradiate. There plant eyes, all mist from thence, purge and disperse, that I may see and tell of things invisible to mortal sight. What is ironic is the back half of Book 3. We meet Milton's God in all of his didacticism, in his capacity as a mouthpiece for Milton's theological stances. Milton's express goal is to justify the ways of God to men, and his God does that. He justifies himself, at least according to Milton's thoughts. I can't fault Milton for putting his own beliefs into his work, but the fault isn't there, it's in his portrayal of God. Milton's God is so eager to justify his own ways. He spends so much time explaining himself, not debating an opposing party, but just expositing to his son and his loyal angels. He hardly feels like a supreme authoritative being, a law unto himself, that we feel in the majesty of the God of the Old Testament, a God who is very clear in places that man cannot even begin to understand his ways. If I didn't know better, I might think that Milton was intentionally downplaying the terrible and powerful aspects of his God to make us believe even for a moment that the devil had the slightest chance. And I know that probably wasn't his intention, but Milton has absolutely unintentionally led a number of people to say that he was rooting for the other team. Let's talk about the other team. The devil is the main character of this poem. He is the main character because he is the most human character. He is the most human character because he has real questions. Milton has his God tell us in a couple places that the reason he gives humanity the option to sin is so that they may choose to obey him out of their own free will. There's one problem with that. Adam doesn't have free will. Adam feels about as sycophantic as ChatGPT. I am not convinced for a moment that Milton's Adam considered sinning until somebody told him that he could do it. I don't think he has real questions. I think the only questions Adam asks are an excuse to let Raphael exposit more. There's one moment where he confronts Eve, pre-fall, but given the general weakness of his character, it feels more like he just doesn't want to do his job by himself. Milton's Adam does not have a transgressive bone in his body up until the point where he eats the fruit. But even after that point, he still comes across as kind of weak and frail. He does not feel like the father of all mankind. Eve is more convincing. The problem with Eve is that Milton doesn't give her much spotlight. With more attention, she might have blossomed into a full and convincing character, but I'm not sure she does. Milton's Satan, on the other hand, he stands in the Garden of Eden, racked with indecisiveness, seriously considering for moments whether he should go back to God and take it all back and beg for forgiveness. His hesitation is a feeling that we know. His regret is a feeling we know. His feelings when he looks at the beauties created by his sworn enemy, his feelings when he looks at Eve, these are human feelings. They are human emotions and human passions. His moment of internal conflict in the garden seems to me to be something of a twisted, distorted reflection of that moment in the New Testament, when a certain Son of Man, destined to crush the serpent's head, will sit in a garden and also exhibit fears and doubts and anxieties about the bitter cup that he knows he must drink. Milton even has to come up with excuses for the devil's acts of nobility. When he volunteers to brave alone the void of chaos and to explore the unknown world at immense danger to himself, when none of the other demons want to do it, Milton has to say that neither do the spirits damned lose all their virtue, and he has to argue that it is only because of his pride that he would take so noble an action. It's not really much a surprise that many people have found the most relatable character in this poem to be the devil. The result is a deep, deep conflict in the text, one that mirrors a deep conflict that sits in the heart of Christianity. On the one hand, you could say that Paradise Lost gives the ultimate voice to a certain Protestant doctrine of total depravity, because it implicitly argues that human experience after the fall is closer to the devil than human experience before the fall, that we can't relate to pre-fall Adam, we can't relate to the angels, because we cannot even imagine what it looks like to have free will, but to be perfectly obedient. And some would say we can't imagine that because our natures are fully corrupt. On the other hand, the work seems to ask, what does free will look like if it's not being exercised? And one answer that is buried deep, deep under the surface text of the poem is that whatever that looks like, it doesn't look human. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I will give a little disclaimer. I don't put a lot of weight on first impressions of serious works of literature, especially poetry. As much as I loved the beginning passages of Book 3, I read them on a beach in San Diego watching the sunset, and it may very well have affected my sensitivity to Milton's poetry at that moment. I will give this a second read. I'll probably do it in context of some of Milton's other works, some of his biggest influences. I'm reading Ovid right now, and some of the historical critical attitudes towards his work. Thanks for watching again. I'll probably do a reading update next. See you all soon.